Okay, hello. Uh, this video is intended to serve as an introduction to Christianity, our considerations of Christianity. Previously, we did a presentation on Judaism. After we look at Christianity, we're also going to put up a couple of videos on Islam. So these are all our Western religions, sometimes referred to as the Abrahamic uh, religious traditions. In this, I'm going to do a second video on Christianity as well that will mostly be, the second video will have to do more with the development of the various churches within Christianity. At this point, I just want to look at the beginnings. And we're going to start by trying to transition from Judaism, and we'll do that by taking a look at the historical situation into which Jesus was born. What was going on in the Jewish world religiously at that time? And then how did what Jesus was teaching or preaching differ or offer another alternative? Uh, Finally, towards the latter parts of this video, I'm going to offer a kind of personal interpretation of Christianity. This is a religion I was born and raised in, uh, and I think I could also say have struggled with for a very long time in order to understand just understand it, or come to an understanding of it that I think gives it its due. So that's a challenge. But I'm going to take a stab at it because I still think there's a lot in Christianity that I have difficulty with, but at the same time, I think there's something there that is worthy of our attention. I believe previously we've already mentioned that Christianity develops out of Judaism in a similar way as Buddhism developed out of Hinduism. In both of those cases, you could say that the newer religion took on a more universal form and had more of a universal appeal than uh, the older religion, and that the older religion in general we characterized as ethnic religions, or the religion of a particular people. Just to start with, the sacred book of Christianity is well known. It's in the Western world, anyhow. The Bible consists of two fundamental parts: the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament is pretty similar to the sacred books of Judaism. Would include almost all of those books. In the New Testament, starting with the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it tried to establish the difference between Christianity and Judaism. In both Judaism and Christianity, I would like to point out that the followers believed that these books were divinely inspired. Before we try to characterize how Christians came to think of Jesus, we could try to take a look at the historical situation into which he was born as a Jew. And this gives us an opportunity to comment a little bit more on what was going on in Judaism, as well as laying the foundation or the for trying to understand the teaching of Jesus as well. We say it's most people would agree or have come to believe that Jesus was born around 5 BCE, that he grew up in Nazareth. I don't know when our official calendar sort of was established, but the scholars have kind of agreed that they thought that the year 0 was the birth of Jesus, but it looks like they missed it by at least 5 years in that regard. At the time when Jesus was born, let's say the Jews were occupied by the Romans, dominated by the Romans, who controlled the entire area of the Middle East, and that within the Jewish communities there were at least 4 different reactions to that occupation or that control by a foreign power. The first of these groups we're going to mention are the Sadducees. I believe there's some mention of the Sadducees in the New Testament. Generally, the Sadducees were an upper class group within the Hebrew nation, and they were pretty well off. I think most temple priests would have come from this group, and as priests, they would have emphasized the need for temporal sacrifice as the central focus for the practice of Judaism. Because they were pretty well off, they accommodated themselves rather comfortably to the Romans, and before that the Hellenistic culture of the Greeks that had come into the area as well. So they didn't really see much need for anything to change. Things seemed to be just fine from their point of view. That wasn't the case with some other members of the Jewish community. One more extreme group, more extreme anyhow, the Essenes, which were not the most numerous group, but they were significant enough to be included here. Thought that the world and in particular the temple and Jerusalem and so forth had become too worldly and too corrupt. They really sought a more pure form of living for themselves in order to have a more spiritual existence. To some extent, they believed that the end might be coming before too long, and they wanted to be prepared for it. So they were pretty serious about living a very pious existence. They advocated withdrawing from mainstream society, and I think for the most part they moved out of Jerusalem south and down towards the Dead Sea, in a pretty desolate desert type environment. And they lived in communities, and there was some asceticism, some voluntary poverty, rejection for the most part of worldly pleasures. So they wanted to change, and they wanted a renewed spiritual existence. And so they felt like they had to leave mainstream society in order to accomplish that. They're also known or associated with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which, I don't know, back in 1950s or something like, I think there was a number of scrolls that were discovered down near the Dead Sea that that people believe were associated with the Essenes. And they kind of revealed that the Essenes were pretty serious students of Jewish text and copied many of the texts and also commented on a lot of the text as well. So that's another school of thought that existed and had been in existence for a good while by the time Jesus was born. The third group within Judaism were the Pharisees, and they are mentioned on a number of occasions in the New Testament. The Pharisees were serious students of Torah, and I believe they believed in the oral Torah as well as the written Torah. And it was the Pharisees who had all these laws that we mentioned when we talked about Judaism, 613 laws that you could try to be obedient to if you want to live a religious existence. So the Pharisees didn't feel like it was the right thing to do is to leave ordinary life, but they felt you could live your ordinary life and just stay in society and then try to strictly adhere to all these different what were referred to as Mosaic laws. And the Pharisees had different views than the Sadducees, so there was some conflict between them. And there's some conflict. I mean, in the New Testament, at least, the Pharisees are usually treated negatively. But you could say that modern Judaism, the beliefs and practices of modern Judaism, derive pretty directly from the ideas of the Pharisees. The fourth group within Israel, or Judea, however the region was called at that time, were the Zealots, and there was it was pretty common that there were a large number of Jews who were dissatisfied with their country being occupied by the Greeks initially, and then later by the Romans as well. So there were a number of rebellions that occurred. And so the Zealots were chief among armed rebels who periodically would rise up and try to expel the Romans from their country. And it wasn't so long, and after the death of Jesus, we say there was a major uprising in the year 66 A.D. So that's maybe 35 years after the death of Jesus, and that war went on for maybe 4 or 5 years. But the Jewish rebels were soundly defeated by the Romans, and the Romans had really, at that point, had just about enough of putting down these periodic rebellions by the Jews. So they pretty much destroyed the city of Jerusalem during that war, and they destroyed the Second Temple. All with the only thing that was left of it was the Western Wall, which still stands in Jerusalem and is an important shrine for Jews. But after that defeat, I mean, the Romans really tried to exile as many Jews as they could to different parts of the world so that they wouldn't have to deal with any more rebellions. So that's a major step in what we call the diaspora, or the spreading of the Jewish people sort of throughout the world and away from their homeland. Well, then, if Jesus was born into this scenario with these other groups already in place, and Jesus was also had a mission or a teaching that he was bringing, He also wanted kind of spiritual renewal for the people, not especially along the lines of the Pharisees with all their laws and rules. Jesus' message was a little simpler, emphasized God's mercy and compassion. And Jesus thought it wasn't really so important to be obedient to all these rules governing what you can eat, combinations of food, all the rules that the Pharisees had that people were supposed to try and pay attention to. So naturally, he came into conflict with the Pharisees on occasions. And that's written of in the Gospels, but it just needs to be said that I think the Gospels seem to overstate the conflict with other Jewish groups in a way. Most of the Gospels were written. The earliest one was written like 50 years after the death of Jesus, so that was they were written during a period when Christianity was trying to separate itself from its Jewish origins and was striving to open up this new religion to people who were non-Jews. So there may have been some influence of that move as well. A lot of the things that Jesus said, I mean, were like hard sayings for people, although they were surprising, and at the same time they had an impact and caused people to think about things in ways that they weren't accustomed to think about them. A lot of the things he said seemed to contradict what common point of view might have been. He would say things like turn the other cheek or love your enemy. Those are kind of counterintuitive for most people, but this was a new and different kind of teaching that Jesus was bringing. He thought you should not, social distinctions were not very important. He thought that the way is narrow, that it's important to be like little children. Unless you become like little children, you can't enter into the kingdom of heaven. He mentions that riches can be an obstacle to the religious life. So it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into heaven. Statements like "Blessed are the poor," "The meek shall inherit the earth." These are all surprising and sort of kind of hard statements to understand. They do reveal a kind of otherworldly or a spiritual and inner emphasis in his teaching. It's like the ordinary, the outer world didn't seem so important to him. The it's hard to, if you're raised within a Christian environment like a lot of us as Westerns were, you've come to take the teachings of Christianity kind of for granted and assume that they were always the same as when we were exposed to them. But at this time, you say the full development and meaning of Christianity wasn't completely formed or realized until after the death of Jesus. And his meaning of his life and his death didn't become clear until after the crucifixion and then subsequent resurrection, for his followers came to believe in the resurrection, that he arose from the dead, and what was the significance and the meaning of those events had to be put into a clear form. Once Jesus was gone, I mean, just need to mention, I think, that the role that the Apostle Paul played in the spread of Christianity. So it took a while for it to catch on. It was clearly a minority movement for a long time. Initially, after Jesus' death, I mean, you could say all his followers were Jews, and all the disciples and the apostles, and there was uh, a lot of thought given to whether or not it was a Jewish movement or whether there was something profoundly different about this new teaching that Jesus had brought. So the Apostle Paul was really the primary mover in interpreting what Christianity was and what it was about, and in opening it to putting it into a form where it was acceptable in the non-Jewish world as well. Uh, One of the stories that have helped me try and understand Christianity and maybe its appeal as well is provided by the story of the Garden of Eden. And you know, I'm not a literal reader of the Bible. I'm looking for meaning in a lot of the stories, and I think it's a pretty interesting approach to try and make sense of some of the stories that, unless you read them metaphorically, they don't make a whole lot of sense to me. But in the Garden of Eden, you say this is a story of that can be used to give an account of ourselves as human beings, and sort of, in some respect, explain our relationship with God and how we got to be the way that we are, and sort of, and, I think it provides an interesting framework for trying to understand what Christianity is all about. If we say that the Garden of Eden, as we all know, tells the story of Adam and Eve living in the garden, and that it's a kind of earthly paradise, and you say Adam and Eve lived there in a state of innocence, and that's kind of a childlike state. We think of children as innocents because they don't really know the difference between right and wrong. And in a way, you have to assume that that was the case for Adam and Eve. And it's not until they commit the first sin, or the original sin, when they eat the forbidden fruit, which is supposedly from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that we could say that Adam and Eve first become fully human, uh, fully, developed human beings who know the difference between right and wrong and have to live with the challenge of making moral choices, in the face of all the other temptations that beset us as human beings. As was said in the last slide, I mean, having eaten the forbidden fruit, their eyes were opened, and and they kind of violated the one prohibition that they were not supposed to violate. So there was punishment sort of laid out on them as a result of that. There were different forms that punishment took. I mean, but it seems like the most profound punishment was that they were expelled from the garden, which meant that they were thus alienated from the presence of God. And we have to assume that in the garden, in that earthly paradise, that while they were still childlike, they lived within the presence of God. But now, as a result of making this developing into full-fledged human beings, they're sort of separated from the presence of God. So this, you could say that this story lays out kind of how we find ourselves as human beings, and that we are sort of moral creatures. I mean, we do kind of know the difference between good and bad, and we have to make our choices sort of in the world. We're also um, arguably inclined, I mean, to turn towards the higher, and we find ourselves uh, alienated from the divinity that we yearn to be connected to. Some philosophers have said that there is in human beings a kind of impulse to return to the source of our being. There's always an impulse within human beings towards higher realms. But, we find ourselves in a situation where the higher is, where the idea of the higher that we have is so far beyond us that it's as though an abyss separated us from the divine. Find ourselves as flawed creatures, finite existences, limited understanding, and limited lifetimes as well. And we're over against, or we yearn in the direction of a creator whom we perceive as infinite and eternal and perfect in every imaginable way. So we kind of have to live with this distance between us and sort of what we most want. You could say it's a peculiar uh, aspect of things. In Judaism and Islam, they have a very similar conception of God and sort of a similar conception of human beings too. But in those two religions, there is no hope. There's hope, for being on right relationship with God. But there's no ultimate reconciliation, any way of bridging the gap between the human and the divine. In Christianity, we'll see that. On this slide, I just have called up an image of the cross in order to try to talk about how to understand Jesus as in his function in Christianity. I'm not good enough with the pen to be able to write very well, as I've discovered. But I just want to point out that the symbol of the cross is two intersecting lines. One is the vertical line, the other is the horizontal line. Let's say the horizontal line really represents the human side of things. You could say the vertical line is a line that represents intersection with the divine. In a kind of time perspective, you would say the horizontal line is chronological time. The up and down vertical axis is like the eternal. So if we say Jesus, I mean, is the primary symbol of Christianity is Jesus on the cross. And you say this Jesus as both human and divine somehow fits into this symbol, which is the source of his suffering as well. Jesus, both human and divine. And maybe human beings, we have something human and divine in us as well. And as we know, with the story of the crucifixion, this intersection of the human and the divine has to be a kind of tension between the two, and that tension is another word for suffering. So the suffering of Jesus on the cross is for a reason. You could say it's God has made Jesus available for human beings as a kind of mediator between himself, God, and ordinary human beings as a way of reconciling humans with the divine. But the cost of that reconciliation this necessarily has to involve suffering. And that's what I think one of the ways to understand the suffering of Jesus. So again, this is our final slide here. That Jesus, by being human and divine, provides a link between human beings and God. As being in the middle, he's the mediator, the intercessor, provides reconciliation between God and human beings, and that Jesus was sent by God to fulfill this purpose. You could say this is an act of love because God loves human beings. He's willing to sacrifice Jesus or sacrifice his suffering for allowing human beings to have an opportunity to bridge this abyss or this gulf between the divine and the human. And that the tension between the intersection, the divine and human, is suffering, but it's suffering for the sake of humanity so that they can be reconciled with God and achieve a kind of salvation, forgiveness for sins, and the promise of eternal life. And that's, one way of trying to understand what the story of Christianity is about and what it offers people. I guess that wasn't really the last slide. I've decided to add one more slide here. I'm just basically going to read this, some final considerations. I think the story we've just told represents the possibility that the human and the divine can be reconciled within each one of us, and that Jesus represents the realization of this possibility. Ultimately, God has made this possibility available. It's given to us, but realization is up to us, remains up to us. Much is needed in the way of understanding and effort. I mean, for me, we've seen this in some of the other religions that we've taken a look at, that the way is hard and long. I mean, it doesn't happen by itself. Some think that belief is all that you need on this path, but to me, belief by itself doesn't seem to be enough. Things of the highest value have to be paid for. They have to be worked for, or in a way, they have to be suffered for. And the possibility that Jesus could live in me is one of these things. At least for now, I mean, this is how I see it. Who knows? I'll see it later. Yeah, nothing's determined once and for all. Thanks for listening.